You're listening to The Creative Impostor. I'm Andrea Klunder. Have you ever heard anyone say, you need to show the work? Oh, maybe that's taking you back to math class, high school math class. Yeah, let's go there. Algebra trig, 11th grade. We had this incredible teacher who we all loved named Mr. H. Mr. H was the best. Algebra trig, not so much. As I recall, algebra trig was the class where you had to do proofs. You know, you'd have a problem and you'd have to make this long, drawn-out explanation using mathematical theorems and principles as to how you arrived at the answer. Now, see, I had a special relationship with math, which was that I could almost always get to the right answer of any problem, but I couldn't always map out all of the steps you were supposed to take to get to that right answer. So one day, Mr. H called me up after a test, and he said, Andrea, I don't think you're cheating, and you're getting all of the right answers, but this proof that you've written out, this isn't right. So I need to know, how are you coming up with the answers when you haven't shown the work? And I don't think I really had an explanation for it, which was frustrating. And then he said, well, I can't give you 100% for this, but I guess I can give you extra credit for creativity. I mean, I had shown some rationale for how I had gotten there. This very long trip down memory lane, all the way back to high school math class, which I hope wasn't too traumatizing for you, is my way of introducing today's guest, Megan Dougherty of One Stone Creative, the Company Show podcast, and Podcasting for Business. Megan is showing the work. So often I have this intuition or these gut level hunches that the way a business owner or a client is going about their podcast could be better. That a podcast designed to do one thing, like sell copies of your book, is not the same as a podcast designed to build your professional network, is not the same as a podcast designed to fulfill your nonprofit organization's mission. I've known this for years, but I could not really ever put my finger on showing the work of how I came to these conclusions. And thank God I don't have to, because Megan is doing it for me. I found Megan originally through her podcast, The Company Show. How did I find her show? I don't have any idea, and that's fine. We tend to want our podcast to do all the things, to fulfill the grand promise of podcasting. And often, we're not exactly thrilled with the results. Putting in so much time and effort and resources into crafting your show and putting it out into the world doesn't feel great when you look at your stats in your podcast hosting software and your numbers are lower than what you feel like they should be. And then don't even get me started on going on social media and seeing this wild, amazing success that everyone else seems to be having with their podcast. You start to think, what's wrong with me? Now, okay, lest you think that this is an episode just about podcasting, take a leap with me. I have sometimes learned so much about my business by listening to podcasts about other things, creative writing, personal finance. You get the picture. If you are involved in any creative venture right now, whether that be a business, whether that be running a department inside of an organization, whether that be a side hustle, whether that be a creative hobby, this conversation with Megan has the potential to give you so many insights into paying attention to the data and using it to make smarter decisions about your potential impact from your creative venture, and how to make that work for you. Now, I do want to warn you that we get straight into talking about numbers and metrics and data, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed. Megan is awesome at explaining topics that could potentially be dry and boring in a way that is easy to understand and engaging. Have I said enough glowing things about Megan? I'm going to say even more in the interview, so we don't need to keep going on. I do need to tell you, however, that if ever there was a time to visit the Creative Impostor show notes, it would be this episode. You can find the show notes in the episode description in your app and at thecreativeimpostor.com. And why do you want to go to the show notes? Because they're chock full of resources, including a link to the Podcasting for Business conference, which is happening virtually, so you can attend from anywhere, November 2024. And I am so delighted to let you know that I am going to be part of a panel all about how to use your most valuable content creation asset, your voice, as part of that conference. Now, here's the super sneaky special deal. The reason Megan is doing a big old podcast tour right now is because her book, Podcasting for Business, is coming out September 10, 2024. And if you are listening to this within the first few days that it comes out, you know that that book launch is right around the corner. And if you pre-order the book by the 10th, you will get a complimentary pass to the Podcasting for Business conference. Now, if you are in business and you have a podcast or you're thinking about adding a podcast to the mix, I highly encourage you to take advantage of this. The book is amazing and you will get value out of it, whether you are or are not podcasting. If you are engaged in any sort of content marketing for your business or your brand, and getting that complimentary pass to the conference, super special cherry on top bonus. Of course, I will also link to Megan's podcast, The Company Show, and who knows what other goodness will be linked there in the show notes for you. All right, that's about enough out of me. I am delighted to introduce you to Megan Dougherty. Well, I do want to start this conversation kind of in an odd place, which is I want to confess to you that over the last 8 to 12 months, I would say, I have been having a little bit of a crisis of faith.
Ooh.
In not so much the craft of what I do as a podcast producer and story editor and consultant, not so much in podcasting in general, but I've been having a crisis of faith in podcasting for business.
Yep.
Because I have had a couple of clients quit their shows, citing just doesn't have the return on investment that I was expecting.
Yeah.
Or I have heard shows that I am a fan of end after many years in production in a lot of cases. I have seen news headlines and articles on LinkedIn about the death of podcasting and have we reached peak podcasting? And I've also seen more and more podcasts adding very annoying, dynamically inserted ads into their shows and a pressure for monetization through advertising models. And then the last thing that has added to this existential crisis is this proliferation of the only podcasts that seem to be like getting any kind of buzz or awareness in the media are celebrity hosted podcasts, which are also typically not my favorite type of show to listen to.
Same.
Maybe I've been wrong about this whole podcasting thing. And so my first question to you, Megan, who you have written a book about podcasting for business, you have a podcast about podcasting for business, you have an entire business built around podcasting for business. So you're probably a little bit biased, but my very direct question is, does podcasting even work for businesses?
The very direct answer is yes, it does. If you've kind of got the right expectations set for what a podcast for your business is going to mean.
Okay, I wish you had just say, yes, it does, period, without the ... if, because then we could just end this interview and I would be feeling better about my life and my business and we'd be good to go.
Yeah, but you bring up something so real and so present because podcasting has gotten so popular over the last, say 5 years. It's absolutely exploded. And it's like another version of the dot-com boom that happened in the late 90s. Everyone was rushing for the gold, trying to stake their claim and making wild promises about what was possible, largely not based in reality. But whether or not a podcast can be useful for an individual business, it's the same question as can email be useful for an individual business? You can invest a lot in email marketing and get no results if it's not well suited to your market, to your business goals. The same with absolutely any other marketing channel. So when you stop looking at podcasting as an objective project that has its own, existing criteria for success and failure, and this is what a good podcast is, and this is what it does for every business. If you let go of all of that and you think about podcasting as this is a tool that I'm using to achieve specific outcomes in my business or in my client's business, well, then all of a sudden you have this multimedia asset that can be used in a whole bunch of different ways to achieve different business outcomes, most of which aren't getting as famous as the top 10 podcasts that are out there. Because most businesses don't need to be one of the top 10 podcasts out there. They need more clients. They need better SEO. They need more visibility. They need more opportunities. And podcasts can do all of those things, but it's around the expectation that you're setting for it and how you're optimizing a show to actually achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
And I'm going to pull out something that you just highlighted, which is this focus around audience size and numbers, where there's this show me the metrics. I want to see the return on investment by seeing that my download numbers are growing.
I'm so glad you bring that particular thing up because the downloads are maybe my biggest frustration in all of business podcasting. Like, obviously, they're important for certain goals. And obviously, it's nice to have them. And if you work really hard, and especially if you invest a lot of money and energy and team bandwidth in a podcast and you see you're getting 150, 200 downloads a month, it sucks. Like, it sucks to feel like no one's listening to you in that situation. But if you start looking at the things that the podcast actually is doing, you can see a really, really different picture by looking at different metrics. And I was chatting with someone recently and she was kind of feeling exactly that way about her podcast. She's like, I've been doing this for 2 years. I've never broke 250 downloads per month. I think I'm going to can it. And so we started exploring that a little bit. And it's like, when you get a new client, how many of them say they met you or they were exposed to you first through your podcast? And she's like, well, this year it's probably happened twice. And we were talking, I think it was in March. So twice in 3 months. I said, what's your deal value for a new client when you get them? And she said, actually, it's about $5,000. I said, you're telling me your podcast has made you $10,000 in the first quarter of the year and you're not happy with the results. And then she became very happy with her results and decided to continue podcasting.
That's awesome that she had that kind of feedback from those clients and she was able to immediately put a dollar value on there. That's incredible. That's like a best case scenario. I also am running into this problem where I see or I hear clients saying that they're not sure how many clients or customers or community members or whatever it is that they're trying to find have signed up by way of their podcast. And I think part of that, because they'll say, well, how are you measuring that? Like, let's say they're enrolling for a program or a course, and maybe 100 people enroll in it. And so how many of those people enrolled because of the podcast? And they'll say, well, we have a form that asks, how did you hear about us or how did you hear about the course? And then I always start thinking, well, how is that form designed? Is it an open-ended question where they have to recall on their own and then write it in? Is it a multiple choice with like word of mouth, friend, referral, email campaign, billboard, whatever it is, but they can only choose one? Because I think a lot of the times, depending upon what somebody is signing up for or what somebody is buying, that choice is not the result of one point of contact.
Yeah.
And so unless it's like a checkbox of like, what are all of the ways that you have heard about us over the past 3 years that brought you to this buying decision, it's not quite conclusive data.
It's true. And like, you're rarely in any data collection going to get perfect data just because it's humans are funny and make different decisions and often don't know why they make decisions that they do. So just for that specific use case, a couple of ways to get a little more purity around that data is have a specific landing page or link, which is the only one you ever mention in your podcast. And, if someone signs up through that one, they definitely did it at least as a last action because of that podcast episode. You might also, if you want to look at the length of time that people took to kind of become aware of you and to start actually doing business with you in some way, because you can't necessarily know when someone first heard of you and when they decided to do something, but you can look at your kind of average sales cycle before you start a podcast and your average sales cycle after starting a podcast. So how has that changed? Has it gotten shorter? The first time someone sends you an email compared to the first time that they sign up for something. So it takes it's work to get this kind of data and this kind of information. And there's always going to be exceptions, and there's going to be people who don't remember how they first heard about you. But you want to kind of give yourself every opportunity to collect the data possible so you know where to make that investment. And this is maybe a good practice for whatever you're selling is when someone buys something, jump on the phone with them for 20 minutes. Have a conversation and get some qualitative data as well as the quantitative to, get a sense of what their journey was. And that's going to give you really good insights. And if somebody just bought something for you, a personal call is going to be a good thing to do anyway to prevent buyer's remorse, to make them feel fantastic about the decision. And you can get that really priceless information.
So I feel like we've been recording, I see the timer and I see that we've been recording for about 10 minutes. And I feel like we got way into the weeds of data really fast. And,
symptom of talking to me. I'm so sorry. I do this. I'm great at parties.
This is a podcast ostensibly about creativity, entrepreneurship, identity. And I will say, even as a business owner, I am a creative business owner, and data is not my favorite topic. Metrics are not my favorite topic. And so I'm hoping that everyone is still listening at this point in time.
I hope so too. I hope I haven't scared you away, everybody.
Numbers. So I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about, you said this is a symptom of talking to me. This always happens. We always start talking about data and numbers. And even in your book, which is called Podcasting for Business, in sort of the opening section, I read, I'm a nerd about podcasts, not the art of them, nor really the technical side of them, although both matter a great deal. Thank you for adding that little comma, because I am a nerd about the art of them and a little bit on the technical side as well.
And I have great respect for that. I really do. In my company, we have team members who are very passionate about the same things.
Awesome. And then the last sentence of that little section is, I'm a nerd about how businesses can use them to create more opportunities, efficiency, and profit. And so I'm kind of curious to hear from you, why is it important for creatives to make friends with the numbers and the data?
Because the numbers and the data, more than almost anything else, will tell you objectively if people are picking up what you're putting down. But, it often is scary and it feels vulnerable, because even when you have like a professional podcast where it's only business related and not necessarily personal, and even more so when it is personal stories and real revelations, it's scary to put that out there. And, if you're doing it for your business, there is a financial component to that. And there is a need to understand, is this work that I'm doing? No matter how I feel like if it's fulfilling, that's great. If it's valuable to the world, that's great. But is it making a bottom line difference in a way that can justify me continuing to invest in the project? And so it's good to be on, and I like what you're saying, be friends with the numbers, because the numbers are giving you feedback about how well other people are responding to what you're doing. And that may or may not be feedback that you want, but it is feedback that it's very important to have so that you can make decisions about, actually looking at how my podcast episodes have performed for the last year. Wow, my audience is really, really interested in writer's block lately. Or my audience is really, really interested in kind of news about the design industry. And you can kind of see over time when you are collecting data, or when you have a nerd collecting data for you is an option. I'll just put that out there. You can
link in show notes.
Yeah, link it. You can make decisions that are responsive to what people need. And that can be a really fulfilling thing, because then you're able to use your creativity to grow your business rather than hope that your creativity can fit inside of it.
It's also making me realize, I started this podcast many, many years ago, before I had a podcasting business, really around this idea of imposter syndrome, which I have had a lot of changing thoughts throughout the years on this phrase. And I was thinking, a lot of times folks are looking at those download numbers and they're seeing 60, 100, 250, whatever number it is. It almost doesn't even matter what number it is, but they're looking at that number and they're feeling like, oh, yeah. And it's making them feel like, what am I even doing? Like, am I doing a bad job? Does no one care? And it creates, like you said, that risk of that vulnerability. Here I am, I'm pouring my heart out, or I'm putting all of these great ideas out there that could like change people's, fill in the blanks of what you're changing for people. or you're having these really amazing conversations with great guests and you're feeling like it isn't reaching them. But what I'm hearing you say in this moment, and I'm just putting this together, is that actually those numbers also can serve to do the opposite, which is to show where your impact can be. I mean, because even if you think about it, like for me, if I do a local speaking event and I have 100 people in the room, what? That's like, yeah.
Huge.
So anyways, that's kind of my roundabout thinking of the same set of numbers, the same data can serve either purpose, which is to make you feel like more of an imposter or more of a fraud or more of a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Or they can actually serve to show you that you're onto something. And I'm kind of curious if download numbers for the sake of numbers, big numbers, aren't it, quote unquote. What are some other examples of metrics without getting, I mean, we're not going to give all the metrics that you have in your book because it's a lot. And I want
15.
people to get the book. 15. Okay. I was trying to remember. I was telling our technical director about your book yesterday. We were having a walk and talk meeting. And I was like, there's like, I don't know, like 50 different metrics in there that you could look at. And downloads are like the last and least important one, you know? So what are some examples of other places to look?
I love looking at brand awareness as a metric. And this one, it can be a little challenging to get numbers on. But when you're podcasting and you are hoping to get, more authority in your space, become more well-known, you want to know who's talking about you and who's thinking about you and who is aware of you. You can't know if anybody's thinking about you because we don't have that technology yet, although I assume it's coming.
Yeah.
But
scary.
Coming. But you can, using tools that exist now, figure out who on the internet is talking about you. You can see when your podcast is being referenced by someone that you didn't ask for a link, or when it's brought up and maybe it's cited in a post, or, you get written up in an article. You can find all of that information and put it together and look over time. Okay, look, the number of people, the different organizations, different companies that are aware of me is going up. I'm being mentioned much more frequently. And that's something that you can track over time to see how it changes as your podcast does. And as we mentioned, there's 15 kind of metrics like that in the book, but there's also something else that is hoping going to be very interesting, especially to people who are less, let's say, driven by mercenary financial or efficiency needs. We call it podcast value math because you can measure anything that matters to you about your podcast. So one example I like to give is, if podcasting for me is a joyful activity, and maybe it really sparks my creativity, I'm just going to keep a little note. I'm going to keep a little file of every time while I'm working on my podcast when I got a new idea and I had that exciting, I need to do this. And then over time, I can see where in the process did I have this? Was it when I was planning episodes? Is it when I'm talking to guests? Is it when I'm like figuring out promotional plans? And that way I can see which parts of the podcast actually spark the most creativity for me and I can do more of those. Or if it's times that I laughed or felt really happy, note those down and say, oh, it's a certain type of guest that I have on the podcast that often brings me that much joy. I'm going to do more of that. And so it's this data as an instructional tool almost that can inform the decisions that you make to bring you more of whatever it is you value. It might be SEO, it might be dollars, it might be downloads even. You're the boss of your podcast. You can go for downloads if you want to, but it might be a lot more negligible. So tracking and being mindful and aware of what's happening in your podcast gives you this amazing power to customize it to bring you more of what you want.
Part of the meeting that I was having yesterday with our technical director is we're actually preparing a proposal right now for a potential new client. And she is not a business owner. She works inside of a government agency. Half of the day I spent yesterday reading the first half of your book. So it was very fresh in my mind. And I was thinking, when we had an in-person meeting with her and her team, and there were two things from that meeting that stuck out to me, which this is an internal podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It's not meant to be public. So that means that actually the number of, quote, downloads or listens is not quite it because there's a maximum audience already built in, right? Then I was like, oh, actually what she's trying to do is she had an email newsletter that they were putting out. No one was opening it. No one was reading it. And she didn't like doing it. And so she was thinking, well, why are we doing this? We still have to get this information out. It is the job of our department to provide this information. But what is a way that we can do it that I'm going to enjoy, that is creative, and potentially can get more engagement from the people it's going out to. And I was like, those are our two metrics right there.
Yeah.
In the proposal, how can we highlight the value of the spend? Because they're not going to make money off of this podcast. This is not, they're not going to monetize it. It's not promoting a business. So they're not trying to get clients. They need something, an experience that is enjoyable to them to produce. And it also needs to be something that, she has a boss who I don't know. And that boss is going to need a justification because making a podcast is infinitely more expensive than making a newsletter. They're going to need a justification as to why this line item is here and why it is what it is. And if she can show an increase in engagement over that newsletter, that's going to be highly important. So what are we going to put into place in the front end to make sure that she can track that engagement and to make sure that what she's creating is something that employees will voluntarily want to engage with? And that was just kind of like a long behind the scenes of how what you're putting forth in this idea of podcast value math, how that can apply to something that isn't even specifically like, I have a business. I need customers. I need to get more customers. I will have a podcast.
Yep.
And I'm kind of curious, you have something earlier in the book before you even get to metrics, which is these blueprints. The blueprints kind of blew my mind.
Excellent.
Let's go back in time even more. I like time machines. This is the benefit of podcasts. So you can travel. First of all, I know that you said to me when we first met that you weren't even into podcasts necessarily when you started this business.
That's true.
So how did you get from, I'm not even into podcasts necessarily, to having this business to the blueprints? Like, what does that trajectory look like? Tell me a story. Take us on a journey.
Well, let's see. If you really want a journey, I was one of those kids who always had ideas for businesses, for how to build things, for how to do things. My mother called me Meggie the Mogul when I was little because I would...
It's adorable.
Pretty adorable. So I'd walk around and be like, hey, we're shopping. And it's like, oh, we're in a dress store, we're shopping for clothes. Like, there should be a store that has a built-in daycare so that moms can leave their kids there while they go shopping. Like stuff like that, right? And so I started doing little side hustles as a kid and just did that all through my education. I ended up getting a non-traditional education by working in startup world for 6 years. And I worked for a marketing education setup, learned how to build businesses and how to see how companies grow and what matters for that. Really, really interesting. Then when I left that company, a former colleague reached out. Her background was in broadcast audio. She was a producer and on-air talent in Dallas. And she reached out to me and she's like, hey, you want to start a business together? And I said, okay.
As you do.
As you do. I was at loose ends at the moment. I was in between projects. And that was 2017. We started Weinstone Creative, and kind of all of this learning and experimentation about how businesses work, how businesses grow, what businesses need that I'd been able to learn through these experiments over my education and through my early career led us to producing podcasts for businesses. And then when I get kind of my claws into something, I really like to get into them. So not only do we produce podcasts, I research podcasts pretty exhaustively. We release an annual research report about business podcasting. I look at shows and I reverse engineer how they do what they do. So over time, we've started building this just like huge mass of information about the different ways that podcasts can be used. And we kind of distilled it down into what you mentioned, the business podcast blueprints. And these are 5 high-level archetypes for podcasts. I call it the prime directive of podcasting, if you'll forgive me another nerdism. And so I usually recommend it. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to this, so don't feel super restricted. If a company or even a hobby podcaster chooses one to start with, one of the blueprints, and it's thought leadership, audience engagement, relationship building, conversion, and content, that's going to focus all of your decision.
Wait,
it's going to focus
say
your
those
energy.
again slower.
I will. Okay. Audience engagement, relationship building, thought leadership, conversions, and content. And each of these is kind of a prime reason for a podcast to exist. If the podcast does nothing else but this one thing and does it well, it's going to be bringing value to the business. And that lets you really make strategic decisions that are in alignment with your goals. Because what happens so often with podcasting, and I'm sure you've seen this, is you get into podcasting and it's a lot of work and it's very exciting. And then there's so much work and there's so much going on the planning, on the recording, on the promoting, that you kind of get lost in it. And you lose sight of the big picture because you're just trying to keep up with the day to day. And then, you do it for 6 months or a year and you look at why you started podcasting and what podcasting actually looks like for you now. And there's very little relationship between the two.
Yes.
And so keeping the blueprint in mind, that high level reason, and really making it an active part of your thinking and your reviewing and your analyzing of your work, you can stay on track a lot more easily. And you can make decisions that are going to help you achieve that goal.
Yeah. Over time, as I've been working with businesses, I started out just in production in terms of craft. Like I knew how to make the thing and I knew how to launch the thing, but I didn't really know that much about strategy. It kind of just was something that over time I've been watching my clients and I've been watching other business owners and my colleagues and watching myself and my own processes and learning as I go. And certain clients started asking me more strategic questions. And then I am the type of nerd who, if you open a question in my mind that I don't have the answer to, and there is even 1% of interest around this question for me, I will find every podcast on that topic. I will read articles. I will find books. I will have conversations. I will ask guests to be on my own podcast if I am in production. I will learn everything there is to know about the answer to that question.
Love it.
And so there have been certain things that I've had maybe intuition, but also just observation where I keep saying to people, a podcast designed to enroll people in your program is not the same as a podcast designed to grow your professional network.
Yes, please keep saying it.
But I didn't really have like the language around like, what is it fundamentally that is different about those two things and how do we put them into these categories so that we can think about them more effectively and more strategically? I'm curious for you, how do you know that this works, these blueprints?
What an extremely fair question. In large part, it's because I didn't come up with them. I didn't whip them out of my brain, unformed. We really largely reverse engineered them from shows that we've worked with, patterns that we saw, shows that we've studied, colleagues that we've worked with and talked to. So it's not really a matter of we created this model out of thin air. It's no, we looked at what was happening and tried to put some structure around it. That's kind of one area. And the other one, and this is less fun, so I'm sorry in advance, it doesn't always work for every business. You can make all of the right choices, but sometimes there's just not a fit. Right. And sometimes you can do an absolutely fantastic job and it doesn't always work. This is why I like collecting the data so much, because you're going to find that out really quickly. Well, really quickly in podcast worlds. That means like within a year, not like in a couple of weeks. But it's like any marketing strategy. Any marketing strategy can work, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for every single business in every single situation. And there are definitely, discernments you need to make about, is this the strategy that's right for my business? If you really want to have like a high-end client enrolling podcast, that's a really hard podcast to get right. You need to have a pretty big network. You need to really have a lot of people that you can draw on. You need to have a good source of people who could be potential clients to come be guests. And you need to have a really dialed in sales process. Now, if you've been in business for 10 years and you've got all of those things, you're going to have a great podcast that works. If you're 2 years in and you just don't have the experience to have all that lined up yet, it might not be the type of podcast that's going to make the biggest difference. And doing something that's either, focused on a lower ticket offer or engaging people who have recently bought for you, who are just about to buy from you, that could be more effective. So it really comes down to, sometimes you've got to try. But when you have a plan, like what I hope is going to be found in the book as more people start reading it, this is the information to let you make really good, educated guesses about what's going to work for you and your business based on where you are in your business and what you need for your business. And then when you make those educated guesses, you're not completely protecting your investment in the project, but you are making it a lot more of a sure thing than just throwing a strategy at the wall and hoping for it to work.
Yeah, I like this idea of reverse engineering things. When you go into a consultation with someone about potentially working together, do you ever worry that you're not going to be able to help them? That they're going to sign up to work with you and you're going to put in your best effort and they're just not going to get the results?
I do worry about it. I think any conscientious business owner is going to worry about whether or not they can always provide the results that they want to. So for me, a big part of kind of getting started with someone new, the first question is a podcast going to work for you, full stop? If you need sales tomorrow, you don't want to start a podcast today. That's a later plan. But there are so many different ways for a podcast to be valuable. If I can get on the same page with someone about the way that's going to be a really good starting place for their business, that can really start the ball rolling for adding different kinds of value. Because a podcast can change over time. It can start off being a relationship building podcast. If you're a newer business and you want to grow your professional network and meet people to maybe share referrals back and forth to help you co-promote different things that you're doing to start, just establishing a place for yourself. Over time, when you say get more clients, that can become like a live coaching podcast where you're demonstrating how great it is to be in one of your paid programs. And that's going to help you on the conversion end. And there's all sorts of different ways that you can take these paths to more and more success with the podcast. But it really is a matter of getting on the same page in the beginning. And what I like to say is everyone who has a podcast is the boss of their own podcast. They get to make the decisions about what they do, even if I don't agree with them. So I guess what I just try to do personally is if I've got concerns, I express them. I make sure they're written down. And if they still wish to proceed, I keep that email.
I have receipts.
But it doesn't happen terribly frequently. I think most people get really, really excited by the idea that you can measure all of these different things and you can optimize for all of these different things. And it might not be the podcast that you dreamed of if you dreamed of making a huge splash and becoming known world over. But that dream is pretty easy to let go of when you start making more money.
I'd love to know, as you've created your own podcast, which is called The Company Show. So we have these blueprints that you mentioned, which were relationship building, audience engagement, content, conversion, and what's the last one?
Thought leadership.
Thought leadership, yes. What blueprint does The Company Show ascribe to? And what is your favorite thing about making that show?
Ooh. So the Company Show is primarily a relationship building show.
I knew it.
And relationship building, that's my favorite blueprint of all the blueprints. Well, maybe audience engagement is like a really, really close second. But my favorite thing about making it is getting to chat with people that I wouldn't otherwise meet. I am not a particularly outgoing person in real life. I'm quite introverted. I don't love getting a lot of attention. So promoting the show is a constant problem. But inviting people to be on the show is a really nice way to make an opening introduction to someone. I've got something to offer right away, which really kind of takes some of the social anxiety out of it for me. And I've met some amazing people doing this. I know run the Podcasting for Business conference. The first year we run it, it was composed almost entirely of speakers who had been guests on my podcast.
Nice.
And now some of those initial guests from years ago are still friends, co-promoters. We, talk to each other. We share each other's work. They're coming back to be at the conference again. And so it's just grown over time. And so I love the possibilities of, strategic relationship building and also easing the social issues around making new friends.
Yes, I agree, because if you say networking event, I immediately want to run screaming as far away from that event as possible. And yet part of me feels like, well, you really should do more, quote, networking. And I'm like, oh, yeah, no, I dislike that possibly more than I dislike metrics. But I've been thinking about, as I've been looking at the creative imposter and my hiatus and why I do or don't want to bring the show back. And I think that's part of my problem is like, I didn't know what that show was supposed to do except build my business.
Yeah.
And the creative imposter, like I did get clients early on from listening to the show, even though it wasn't necessarily about podcasting. So I wasn't even trying to sell my services. I was just having conversations about what I was curious about and inviting people I wanted to talk to onto the show. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about. I missed creating this show, but I couldn't justify spending more time and energy on making it. When you're producing for clients all day long, kind of the last thing you want to do is then go ahead and produce for yourself.
Absolutely.
Unless you can justify it. And I was just thinking, like, what role does it play? Is it marketing? Is it bringing me new clients? Most of my clients come from referral and word of mouth. I don't need a podcast to do that. And I think, as I was kind of playing this game of like, okay, which blueprint does this show fall under? Which blueprint does this show fall under? Which, I was like, oh, this is a relationship building show. And it doesn't honestly matter how many people are listening. I do love you, listeners, and I care about you very much. But it matters that I'm bringing people like you on here that I can grow my network. And I'm learning so much from you already and from your book. I'm getting a speaking opportunity to be part of the Podcasting for Business conference, which is great because that is another way, besides referral and word of mouth, speaking engagements to the right audiences in the right spaces are another way that I have grown my business. And I know that I do well in that setting. And so it's bringing about those connections that are mutually beneficial. Yeah, so I think this is a relationship building show.
and look how beautifully, when we were chatting about the conference a little while ago, I asked, of course, the question, how did you find out about me and us? And you said, by listening to your podcast. Well, would you look at that and look at what's happened because of that? And I love that you've kind of found this relationship building angle. So now that you know that, you've got this kind of like buffet of options ahead of you for how to optimize it. So in a relationship building show, you want to, of course, be strategic about who you talk to, getting to know the people and the influencers that you like. And you can increase the number of touch points that you have with them to really make it a real relationship. So we got to have a prep call. It was for another purpose, but it was still a prep call where we talked about the show and other things that were happening. And good, that was kind of the foundation. That means we both came to this podcast knowing each other a little and being excited to see each other again and to talk about it. And then afterwards, I'm absolutely sure, because you're a professional, you're going to be sending me some great assets that I can use to promote this episode, which I'm going to do. And all of these are relationship building touch points that you can repeat, and they're processes that you can make smoother. And, your virtual Rolodex is now growing. I love it. Relationship building podcasts, they're so good. And I think underappreciated in the industry.
And I think it also takes the pressure off. Your podcast doesn't need to do all of the things and fulfill all of the functions and build your network and bring you clients and create a platform for thought leadership. And like, that's a lot of pressure on your podcast to provide all those things. And when you can really focus in on one, it sort of takes the pressure off. Do you get resistance from people about picking one?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. I do. And so glad you put it like this, because you're going to focus on one. It doesn't mean you're not going to get all of the others.
Right.
But you've taken the pressure off all of the others and you've focused on doing one thing really, really well. But the other stuff is still going to happen over time, and it's still going to be coming up. But the idea of restriction at the outset is really challenging for a lot of people, especially because the models that we have for podcasting out in the world, they're big, they're flashy, they're attention getting. There's kind of this idea of this is what a successful podcast is and what it looks like. And if you don't have that, well, you're not doing it right, or you're not being successful.
What's wrong with me that I only have X, insert literally any number of downloads?
Exactly. There's all of this creativity and opportunity that comes from restriction. Because when you start trying to do one thing, and say in our case, it's relationship building for our podcast, we're going to look at different ways to do that and different ways to make that better and different ways to leverage relationships once we have them. And that's a whole pile of new opportunity for the business that came because we focused on one thing.
Yeah.
In the background, the podcast is doing other stuff. It's helping our SEO on our websites. It is nurturing new clients who are like maybe checking us out for the first time, and they're going to listen to an episode. And I kind of like what she's saying. It's doing all of that stuff while you're focused on this highest value.
Yeah.
So I think we initially started this, it came back to me, resistance to choosing one, because you want the affiliate income, and you want the downloads, and you want the relationships, and you want the SEO, you want it all. But when you try to get everything, you get nothing. And when you try to get one thing, you often get a lot more than you expected, even if it's not exactly what you did expect. So I think embrace the restriction and the creativity that can come from it.
Embrace the restriction. Ooh, that sounds very edgy. Oh, I love that. We talked a lot about the book, but we didn't talk about as a creative. So you have, wait, I made a list. Hold on. Let me look at my list. So your business is One Stone Creative. Your podcast is The Company Show. Your conference that I'm excited to be a part of this year is Podcasting for Business Conference. And now you have a book, Podcasting for Business. Why a book? Why was that the logical next creation or iteration of your intellectual property? And what has that process been like?
Yeah, so it was really important to me to have a book, because kind of what I'm saying in the industry is, one, not being said by a lot of people, at least not that I'm aware of, not yet. And it is also not simple. as you mentioned, it's kind of a hefty book. It's about 80,000 words when you get into it. And it was important for me to have it in a really structured, official format, partly for the credibility. You can say, look, no, this is real. This is a book. This has the legitimacy of the printed page. Because I'm a reader. I'm a bibliophile at heart. And so having one is like, did it. But it also will act very much as a reference guide. I can talk about the business podcast blueprints on 100 podcasts, and I can write 100 different blog posts about it. And that's going to be information that's valuable and that's useful and that gets out there, but it's really disparate. And it's not as usable as something that's all in one place that you can turn back to and refer to and relook up something. So I wanted to make something that was really going to let people use this methodology. And also kind of within the industry, I'm sure you have noticed at different times, and I'm sure many of your listeners have as well, it is frequently male dominated. And there's a lot of raw podcasting is the best energy. And coming at that from a really different perspective of, I'm not maybe a natural born podcast industry member, but there is valuable resources here.
Natural born podcast industry member.
And I say that with love and affection. Podcasting is a very friendly industry for the most part, but I find it a little overwhelming. With podcasting is so great, and you have to love the craft, and you have to do it even if nobody's listening to you, and you have to do it until you eventually succeed, which is inevitable, which is not true. And so having a book, for me, it's a way of like staking my little piece in the industry. And I think it feels very good to have done. I'm very happy to have done it. And I think I've created something that is going to be valuable for people. And that ultimately is what I wanted to do more than anything else.
How long did it take you from starting to work on the concept to publication?
Let's see, I started working on this book on March 15th of this year.
That's so fast. That feels fast to me.
There's a good reason for that. I did not do it alone. I worked with a book coach. So I went through her 12-week coaching program. And by the end of that, I had a finished first draft, which I will, again, modify a little by saying I was able to repurpose some earlier content, some podcast episodes. It was not 100% written in that amount of time. And the other fun thing about it is because if I'm going to be uncomfortable doing something and I was uncomfortable writing a book, may as well turn that up to 11. We documented the entire process of writing it as a podcast series.
Wait, where is that? What is that? Can we hear it?
My book coach was Amy Collette of Unleash Your Inner Author. The whole 7-episode podcast series of the good, the bad, and the grumpy of coaching and being coached is on unleashyourinnerauthor.com/podcast.
Oh.
We thought it would be fun to be able to showcase how valuable coaching is. Yeah. So it's a case study for her business. And it's this wonderful kind of behind the scenes of writing the book and how we developed the outline and went through the different processes. It was really a fun thing to do, even if I'm a little, I guess, anxious about having that much personal work being out there in the world.
I love this idea. If I'm already going to be uncomfortable doing this, why not turn it up to 11 and get really uncomfortable?
What? We're already halfway there. Let's go the rest of the way.
That is amazing. And what I do want to say about there's a lot of things that I can say about the book. And, you mentioned the word reference, which my inner, nerd who learned how to do research from first grade onward and, loved the card catalog at the library back in the days.
Yeah, that's the good stuff.
Why did I love the card catalog so much?
Because it was awesome and it had everything in it. And you could...
The word reference doesn't scare me, but it may make something sound dry. And I appreciate how well organized the book is. And it is full of information and it could be used, as a reference. But it also is a really enjoyable read.
Oh, good.
I like that there's bits of your personality through there. There's some of, your humor in there and, moments where you would say something. And I, as somebody who I've been in this podcasting space since about 2015. And again, it's a very welcoming, very warm space. And it's an industry I love to be part of. But there are some times where I'm like, why is this the common advice that everybody is giving? And I feel like it's totally wrong. This does not align with me, my personality, my experience, what I see at all. And I'm reading through and I'm like, yes, I always say that. Yes, I feel this way too. Yes, someone else has the same opinion I do. I'm not the only one. Oh, wait, no, Megan thinks this way too. Amazing. Yes. So I was cheering inside as I was reading this PDF of the book.
That is amazing to hear. That is absolutely fantastic. Podcasting for business ultimately is a form of marketing, right? And internet marketing is not the friendliest or most ethical industry in the world.
Sure.
Because people sell what's easiest to sell.
Yeah.
Not what is most effective to do. And that, I think, often with very good intentions, happens in a lot of the podcasting industry. Because, the common advice is keep doing it and keep at it and be consistent until you succeed. Fine, and that's great if it's a passion project. You can keep at it, but it's not if it's a business. You can't do that. You have to have some kind of justification for the energy and the expense of running a podcast. And that's what I'd like to empower people to have.
What you're creating and what you're offering, I think, just even if you take it out of podcasting, it really applies to different media strategies as well, not just podcasting, of really looking at what is the purpose that this thing that I'm doing in my business is meant to serve. Because it's really easy to get overwhelmed by well, we need to have an email newsletter, and we need to have a blog, and we need to have a podcast, and we need to have a YouTube channel, and we need to have, but in the meantime, you still have to deliver the thing that you are selling.
You have a whole business to run.
And whether you have a team or not, it's very easy to get into the weeds of content. Yeah. I think this is just a way of expressing gratitude and saying this really helps with looking at not even just justifying the existing of something that you want to create, but really making smart decisions about it.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm so glad to hear it. And I hope that the process of finding these numbers and communicating them becomes more fun for you. I hope it becomes like an enjoyable part of the day, because there is so much interest in it.
So we've talked a lot of detail and specific about podcasting. We've talked about existential crisis. We've talked about the process of creating the book and vulnerability. What is something that you would love for creative entrepreneurs, small business owners, those who may be podcasting, those who may be thinking about podcasting and wondering if it's really worth it? Can it really work for my business? Or even those who may not ever have a podcast, but they're just in a creative business and thinking about content in general and how they're putting themselves out there and how they're promoting their business. What's sort of a high level something that you can give them to start to consider without getting too overwhelmed about either setting themselves up for success in terms of creating content around their business or measuring the results?
I think the piece of advice, or kind of maybe the action step, is think about in your business. And maybe it's your content creation, maybe it's service delivery, maybe it's something else. What do you value about it? Outside of maybe the straight money that you might make or are making from it. But what are things that add value to your life and to your business and to the way you experience the world? Because the same principle that can make a podcast more effective can make all sorts of other things more effective as well. And so if you really get clear on, this is what matters to me, you can optimize for more of it. And so I think spending some time thinking, maybe even on, a quarterly or annual basis, is what do I value? What do I want? What brings me joy in my business, in my work, in my life? And what am I doing to make more of that happen? That's the basic principle, I think, of making anything more efficient and creating more opportunities with it, by understanding what it is we actually do want. Because I think often we don't examine that. You get into a business, you get busy, or even if it's creative, even if you started it because you love it, well, then all of a sudden you've got your bookkeeping due on Friday and another email that needs to go out on Tuesday, and it's exhausting. We don't spend enough time thinking about, why is this joyful? Why is this fun? Or what about this is joyful? And thinking about those and highlighting them, I think that would be my advice for everyone listening right now.
I love that. Megan, is there anything else that is on your mind or coming to the surface that you want to say before we end?
Oh, I think as a very final note, I would say, don't be afraid of data. Even if you think you're not a numbers person, or even if the thought of it kind of gives you the screaming memes or just bores you in advance, there is fun and there is interest and there's powerful information in it. So try to make friends with your data just a little bit if you can.
What do you think? Are you excited about data? I want to thank you, Megan, so much for coming on The Creative Impostor. I know I had a really good time. I think you had a good time too. And listeners, I hope you had a good time. And I hope that you'll join us for the Podcasting for Business Conference, November 2024. And if you want that super special deal, pre-order Megan's book, Podcasting for Business, by September 10th so that you can get a complimentary pass to make sure that your Podcasting for Business venture is as rewarding as you dreamed it could be. Links, of course, are in the show notes, in the episode description in your app, and at thecreativeimpostor.com. The Creative Impostor is produced and edited by Andrea Klender. That's me. Our theme music is by Jovia Armstrong. I thank you so much for listening. And this week, I encourage you to get clear on what it is that matters to you, and then optimize for more of it.